nothing broken on that end.
We're recording. Just a test.
Hello. Welcome to my garage. Hi everyone, Ryan from CarParts.com. Today we're working on 2012 Ford Transit Connect. We're doing a front end refresh. What that entails is replacing control arms, wheel hubs, tie rod ends, as well as shock absorbers. We have our control arm and wheel hub knuckle assemblies here. We have the OEM, our new parts as well. There's going to be some construction required here. There's these ball joints we have to attach these two to one another. On most vehicles, older generation vehicles, you have to remove the old wheel hub assembly and press them on. This is a Gen 1 style bearing. With this one we went for a whole knuckle assembly. We'll replace everything at once and there won't be any kind of deconstruction required. Control arm goes back in, same thing with the bolts and nuts. There shouldn't be any kind of real construction necessary on this. I'm just going to reattach it to the knuckle and it should all slide back in. We have our McPherson strut compressors here. They're threaded rods basically, and it's going to take the spring and compress it. You tighten side to side, side to side, until the spring completely compresses. Then you can take the whole thing apart and take out the tube and place it onto the new component. We do sell this on CarParts.com. I might want to avoid doing too specific instructions on how to use these because they are pretty dangerous to use. You want to use a wall-mounted spring compressor if you can. But we do offer these on CarParts.com. So we have these spring compressors kind of tightened up on here. And you should see the spring should be pretty free floating in there once you have them tightened up correctly. We want to remove this nut on top right here. Okay. And the best way to do it is you can use a ratchet. It might spin in there, but if you have an impact gun like this, you should be able to go in there and it should be able to stay steady. This might try rotating. You can have something to try to prevent that from rotating. Hold the knife like that. And the whole assembly should come apart like that. And we have a replacement part. You want to do everything in reverse, the same way you took it apart, because you want to put it kind of back together. So you have the dust boot that goes in there. You have the top hat that goes on there. It should come with a new nut for this top part right here. And you can use your impact or your wrench to put that back on there. And there's even an Allen on the end there, an Allen key, if you want to use that to tighten with a wrench so this doesn't spin as much. I'm trying to find that's it right there. We're going to start working on the tie rod ends here. A helpful little tip is that this is where they do your alignment. When you go for like a front end alignment on a car, this is a piece of it at least. So when you start removing these things, you're going to adjust the alignment on the car. When you're doing a front end refresh like this anyways, you're going to need to have the car aligned at the end of the day. But a little helpful tip would be take on here. You can see where this is adjusted to. And the way they change your alignment on the front of your car is by either pulling this out or pushing it back in. So if you want to help out the tech who's going to align your car, or just make your drive to the shop a little bit easier so it's not totally out of line, is you can mark off to where that tie rod end was sitting before like that on the threads. And when you install your new piece, you're at least closer to your original alignment on the vehicle and you're not going to be driving with your wheel at a 45-degree angle. We removed the old tie rod end here. But the important part I want to show the customers is that it's a 2-nut system, so the tie rod end screws on like this, and then this piece also moves, and that's how the adjustment is made. So when you're removing this initially for the first time, you want to loosen this up, then this should be loose to unscrew all the way off. Take the new one, place the nut back at that point where we have the Sharpie mark, and you want to turn the new tie rod end to that point. Clocking isn't very, very important, but you want to get as close as possible to where it was before. Then you want to take your wrench and then tighten it up in relation to this. You can do a final tightening later on because this will be back into the control arm and knuckle. But you can place this back in there, but just remember to tighten this up later on, and then that's where they're going to do their adjustment as well. We have a control arm here. We're going to place it back in here and just kind of piece everything together. The knuckle eventually will attach to here as well, but we're going to place the control arm in here. In the meantime, we can start putting everything in reverse order when we removed it. So we have most of the new components in here now. The strut assembly, tie rod ends, the control arm. Not everything's tightened down yet. I want to kind of get everything in the car before I finally do the tighten down on those. Just because these are all big moving systems that all have to kind of line up with each other, and you want as much play as possible in the beginning. So this is the knuckle assembly that we have here. I'm first going to feed it into the half shaft, just because that's the shortest section. You can get it into any kind of clocking position you want. It doesn't have to be clocked in an individual way, particular way. Slides in. Then we can control it, or put this on the control arm. It's on the control arm. Now it's on the control arm, and it can move freely. You want to push it down and get it lined up with this strut assembly here. Strut assembly should have some movement as well. And then finally, we have the tie rod end. And that's everything at least loosely back in here. Now that we've got everything mostly assembled and back into place where it should be, I went ahead and put each bolt and nut where they should be as well, so everything's at least placed there. Everything's statically held in. So what we're going to do is we're going to tighten up this back sleeve is here, right here. We can do each of these ball joints, tighten up the control arms, place back these assemblies and this ABS sensor, make sure everything's tightened up. We're going to put back on the brake rotor, brake pads, and then tighten up the axle nut finally once we can apply the brakes and give it a good torque, because you want to make sure that this stays on nice and tight. I will show as we put this on finally that we do have two bolts that we want to put Loctite back onto. So liquid Loctite, you can see this one has blue on it. We want to make sure that these ones that hold on the caliper have Loctite on them. It's a very, very important bolts on the vehicle. A great tip to make sure you keep in mind this whole time is when you're tightening up all the bolts and going through and making sure, you really want to triple and quadruple check to make sure that you've hit every bolt that you've touched on here, and at least checked it even if you didn't loosen it or if it was part of your project. Especially when working in the suspension area like this, everything is very, very, very important to the operation of the vehicle. So you want to go through and manually check and make sure you tighten them. You've put any kind of castle nuts, you put the cotter pins through, you've torqued everything. If they require any kind of Loctite, you put Loctite on there. Because if anything were to fail or fall out in this region, the operation of the vehicle would be severely compromised. So I've gone through and I've double, quadruple checked everything, tightened everything, make sure that all my castle nuts have their cotter pins through there. We've gone through the vehicle, make sure that we have the sensors in there. Everything's been tightened up, and we checked it several different times. Just make sure you're putting to the correct torque that the factory is specifying. And if you have any kind of thread sealant or thread lock that you need to put on there, you're putting that on the vehicle at that time. So I've gone through and checked it a couple times now, and it's time just to put the rotor back on. I'm going to break this free because this has been hanging on the zip tie the whole time to not cause damage. Place it back here. And these are the two bolts that hold on the caliper. And these are very, very important in the vehicle. And you most of the time will put thread lock, thread sealer on there of some type. Because if that caliper were ever to come off, you would lose your brakes and you'd lose power in your whole brake system. So these are very, very important, and they go right back behind here, behind the rotor. We've gone through and checked everything. We've made sure that these two bolts that hold the caliper are tightened and have thread sealant on them. And then also once it's been assembled, you can start applying brake pressure again. So I had my assistant apply brake pressure, and then I tightened the axle nut here, which is very important. This preloads the bearing, holds on the assembly. I mean, there's a lot of things that this is extremely important to have this tightened correctly, as well as it helps drive the vehicle. So you'll make sure you tighten this correctly. About 200 foot-pounds we went for, but you have to check your vehicle factory specifications for the torque on the axle nuts. From here, it's always good to go back and check one single time, make sure everything's tightened up, you're ready to go. We're going to place the wheel back on and place the vehicle down. Once you have everything back together, you want to start these by hand, thread them on, but once you get to the point where they're all threaded on tightened, you want to make sure you use a torque wrench. This is an extremely important piece of equipment that everyone needs in their garage. We have these available. You want to make sure that you read up the specifications on the vehicle and tighten these in a star pattern. So if you have a 5 lug like this, you want to go across like that and tighten them until they're fully torqued. So the torque wrench, place it on there. You want to push down, and you want to make sure your apply pressure doesn't slip off, and use your palm to tighten down on there until you hear a clicking noise like that. It means it's fully torqued. You don't want to push through or pull back up. You want to open palm, make sure you're at the right torque for each of those. You want to go in a star pattern, make sure that you're torqued at the correct torque for these. You can over tighten them, and you can under tighten them, so it's very important to get it exactly right. Take your time with this. This is very important. Make sure they're all tightened, and you're ready to put it back down.